Mingwei Huang. She is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and fellow in the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality at Dartmouth College. In South Africa, she's also affiliated with the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at Wits University. Her work has been published in Scholar and Feminist Online, Radical History Review, and 2 edited volumes. And she has a recent article which has just come out in Public Culture. The title of her talk today is Going Underground. So welcome, Mingwei.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm going to present some new work based on my field work, and okay, here we go. It's called Going Underground. During my first visit to Sandton, Johannesburg's financial district, the Sino Steel Plaza building caught my eye. 17 stories of blue glass windows and bold red characters reaching toward the sky. Next to it was the China Construction Bank and a rock and roll McDonald's, its iconic golden arches in the shadow of global China. On the heels of South Africa's diplomatic recognition of the PRC in 1998, the year 2000 was a watershed moment. Beijing hosted the inaugural Forum on China and Africa Cooperation, and the Bank of China and China Construction Bank opened their first South African branches in Sandton. Johannesburg has long functioned as a continental gateway from colonial outpost to post-apartheid world-class city. Since the beginning, Chinese state-owned banks recognized Sandton as the, quote, advanced base for the development of the African market, end quote, as China Construction Bank put it. Trade, investment, and the internationalization of the yuan have grown tremendously. While scholars have diligently produced trade and debt figures, these figures don't tell us that much about how monetary mobilities are made. As C.K. Lee observes, discussions of China and Africa, quote, misconstrue Chinese capital as a quantifiable thing rather than a set of contested processes, end quote. From Sandton, money seems to have never moved between these two countries with such ease, such fluidity. However, China City, the Chinese wholesale market where I've been conducting fieldwork since 2013, tells a different story. Transnational mobilities of people, goods, and capital proceed along 2 tracks, one along Beijing-Johannesburg financscapes and another underground. My interlocutors, ordinary migrants, most of whom left Fujian and Guangdong to become wholesalers in Johannesburg in the early 2000s, identified as normal business people. They represent different kinds of capitalist actors from Chinese state capital and the firms that tend to dominate the China-Africa story. They were not the energy, mining, and manufacturing corporations Chinese banks in Sandton served, nor were they the intended audience of ads for China Union Pay cards or new foreign exchange apps that lined the international terminal of OR Tambo Airport. For most of my interlocutors, migration is a capital accumulation strategy. The goal is to make money, 挣钱, for their families and children in China. They described their economic practices as straight, 正规, meaning compliant with official norms and laws, or going underground, 走地下, through unofficial or informal channels. Profits happen on the edge of the law, the shifting liminal zone between the formal and informal, licit and illicit, and legal and illegal. So my purpose is not to expose illegal practices as an end unto itself. Rather, I'm interested in the porous, shifting borders and boundaries between markets, states, moral economies, and the law, and the heterogeneity and contingencies of what gets black boxed as Chinese capital and global capital. Anthropologist Anna Singh has argued that the channel and channel making activities are just as important as the flow and global circulations. So I'm more interested in thinking about channels than flows here. So the economic growth dubbed Africa Rising is the product of neoliberal globalization in the forms of transnational extraction, corporate enclaving, experiments in offshoring and financialization. Writing about Southern Africa, anthropologist James Ferguson pointed out that the global does not flow, but hops between points, quote, efficiently connecting the enclaved points in the network while excluding with equal efficiency the spaces that lie between the points, end quote. This idea of hopping reiterates observations about flows and channels Walter Rodney long made in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Trading companies introduced, quote, several straws for sucking out for the sucking out of surplus, end quote. Colonial banks transferred profits to metropolitan money markets. Rodney gives the example of Standard Bank of South Africa, which the British chartered in 1862 in the Cape Colony, and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China acquired a 20% share of in 2007. Although Rodney's critique is grounded in the material conditions and specificities of European colonial capitalism and Marxist debates of the 1970s, I find the emphasis on infrastructures of circulation useful for considering how money moves in Sino-African contexts, its flows, hops, and channels, and to what effects. So this talk considers the fluidity and also non-fluidity of Chinese capital in the direction of South Africa to China, and is concerned with the role of race, two things that might not seem to go together. So I argue that Chinese capital is prone to immobilization. It moves through loopholes and localizations of racial difference that ultimately retrench racialized global inequality. China City and Chinatown, where I did my fieldwork, run on cash. Cash is the nimble medium that enables a host of flexible practices that make trading profitable because of its untraceability. However, sending money back can be harder than making it. So when I was working at China City, I often wondered how these huge piles of South African bills of rand made their way back to China and became usable there. What were the material processes of exit and entrance and conversion? The legal option is through South Africa's singular discretionary allowance, which allows South African ID holders, meaning citizens and permanent residents, to send 1 million rand per year abroad tax-free through regulated foreign exchange providers, or Forex. The legal option is only available to traders who conduct their businesses straight, Mingwei, start to finish, using banks and paying taxes on imports in full. In the hyper-competitive market of China City and many of these wholesale malls, for most small-scale traders, going straight is unprofitable. I interviewed a Taiwanese banker who works with mainland Chinese traders. He explained the predicament most of his clients find themselves in. Quote, everyone has been cutting corners like that. And then if you've been cutting corners, then you can't send money back, end quote. So traders need underground ways to send money out. And I have two examples. I met Mellie, a third generation Chinese South African, at the warehouse she managed. She used to work for a shipping company where she worked with Chinese importers. And before then, for a Chinese Forex firm that the South African Reserve Bank shut down for fraud in the early 2000s. For 3 years, Mellie helped Chinese clients send money back to China. How the money moved stunned me. Mellie scouted ID holders in townships, poor places, she said, where predominantly poor Black South Africans would exchange usage of their discretionary allowances for cash. It was easy to recruit people and find a notary to make a certified copy of the ID. Mellie put her body on the line, and in our interview, she showed me a bite mark on her arm and recounted attempted carjackings. It's a hard job, the worst job, a rotten business, she described. The conversion of bills to foreign currency, however, happened through official channels. Mellie would take the client's cash to a legitimate Forex company, which transported it to the Reserve Bank, where the cash would be cleared with the proper paperwork and then transferred to a private Chinese bank account as yuan. These were fraudulent operations, but as Mellie described, they were legit companies. They used, quote, the loophole system, which was not right. It was following the rules where the loopholes were, end quote. These defunct Chinese Forex companies, of which there were others, lay bare how abstracted global capital moves through particular actors, places, and processes in messy, embodied, and territorialized ways. Scholars of racial capitalism have demonstrated the ways in which capital relies on racial difference and its constant reproduction. In this case, the illicit flow of money across national borders and currencies was legally routed through poor South African communities, citizenship papers, legitimate Forex companies and notaries, and the racialized economic inequality underlying it all. Anthropologist Hannah Appel, in a recent ethnography of corporate offshoring in Equatorial Guinea, asserts that race is central to practices of extraction and enclaving. Racial inequality is constitutive of capitalist markets, not only exacerbated by them or simply context for them. Global capitalism needs massive racial subsidies to expand, Achille Mbembe writes, and racializes surplus populations to do so. In an essay titled Existentially Surplus, Grace Huang argues that as finance has overtaken production, surplus populations now include non-laboring subjects, quote, that are not surplus to production, but to speculation and circulation, end quote. It was a localization, perhaps a hyper-localization of racialized surplus populations that enabled the making of legal loopholes and the mobility of undertaxed Chinese capital that might otherwise be immobilized. Significantly, Black Township residents have been historically excluded from the formal economy and mainstream financial institutions under decades of what Deborah James calls credit apartheid. They also have disproportionately been represented in South Africa's unemployed, which reached over 30% of the population in the years that Mellie was scouting. There's another history of Chinese and Black South African township encounters that lingers on the edges of Mellie's story for me. It is not insignificant that a Chinese South African woman was the intermediary. Mellie knew the ins and outs of regulatory systems, Chinese business norms, and geographies of inequality. Growing up under apartheid, her family operated a butchery that served predominantly Black factory and sugarcane workers in Durban. Faffi is a century-old illicit lottery played among Black South Africans, which new migrants from Fujian and Guangdong continue today. This was indeed the profession of my downstairs neighbor in Chinatown, a new migrant from Guangdong, who parks the bulletproof truck he drove at the house. In her memoir, writer Ufreda Ho pays tribute to her father, the Faffi man, and remembers accompanying him to the township to collect betting slips and distribute wins. Her father's secret profession was a lifeline for the family when Chinese were shut out of employment opportunities during apartheid. Faffi was an example of interdependency on the margins. Ho writes, quote, Faffi needed two groups on the edge of society, separate but bound together, to connect momentarily in the collusion of circumventing the ways of the mainstream. The end goal for both groups was to walk away with a few extra rand in their pockets, even if it meant they were taking from each other. Theirs was a pact forged from their mutual conspiracy against the apartheid system. The Faffi man and the poor Black man of the townships were pushed toward the periphery. Neither was part of what whirled in the tight inner circle, white wealth, end quote. So returning to the Forex company Mellie worked for, the dynamics of capitalism, race, and the law have profoundly changed. But perhaps, and this is really quite speculative on my part, the image of the Chinese outsider arriving in the township with cash remains part of collective memory. In this instance, Chinese capital, not part of imagined smooth Beijing Santon channels, unexpectedly detours through the township, a place financial institutions had for long abandoned. The so-called free flow of global capital moves through formal and informal channels made by sedimented histories of racialized disenfranchisement. So I'm going to turn on screen sharing for this second example. Okay. So on the ground level at China City, in the middle of a busy corridor, inconspicuously wedged between two shops, there is a shop fitted with bulletproof glass. There is no signage. Known through word of mouth, the shop is an open secret among the Chinese traders who used its services before it closed. Its unassuming facade is simple. 3 panels of semi-opaque tinted glass span the entire width of the shop exterior. On the outside, surveillance cameras pan the vicinity from above. An intercom dangles from the door. A face-level camera is mounted above it. Inside is another door connected to a fingerprint reader, its luminous light, green light shining in the darkness. On the white walls hang framed photographs of the owner posing with local politicians. Shrouded in secrecy, the dark window is a looking glass, cordoning off another economic world. In an accidental discovery, I learned by chance from a security guard that this used to be what they called the cash room, or what traders called the underground bank, or Disha Qianzuang. So these native banks originated in 18th century China as an alternative to semi-governmental banks for merchants to send money across regions. In the post-reform era, small underground banks are a reliable way to transfer money. They exist in the gray area of technically illegal, but popular private financial institutions that Kelly Tsai calls back alley banking. So this cash room was for Chinese tenants only. Traders would bring hundreds of thousands of cash to the spot and stand in front of the camera, ring the intercom and enter. After making the deposit, within a few days, the equivalent yuan plus a fee would be wired to their bank account in China. Every day, an armored car made a cash collection. By the time I did my fieldwork, the operation had been preemptively shut down because the Reserve Bank was watching it. Too much cash in and out, a China city manager told me. The underground bank hides in plain sight. It was legible to those who knew how to read for it, how to decode the surface. As one trader described, 挂羊头卖狗肉, meaning hanging out a sheep's head to sell dog meat. So many Chinese wholesale malls have a room like this, and there are many in Chinatown. China City's management partnered with a major South African bank I call NCB, which has been making inroads to get Chinese migrant traders to bank with them. NCB opened its own underground bank style cash room. So the entirety of its planning, construction, and demise proceeded during my fieldwork. It seamlessly blends into the wall, simulating the underground bank. It too has two sets of doors with bulletproof glass, surveillance cameras, and an access keypad. Without any markings, it is also hidden in plain sight. During its brief existence, all traders, this time not only Chinese, but also Indian and Pakistani tenants, could enter to make deposits. Now that the secret was out, Chinese traders feared being followed on the way to the widely known cash room. Management responded by adding a steel gate and an armed security guard, which only attracted more attention. Finally, the cash receptacle inside was moved to the management office, and the cash room was abandoned. I'm gonna exit. So to wrap up, my aim is to offer a critique of Chinese capitalism from the ground floor. My bigger point from these two examples is that global capital functions as global racial capital that disjointedly moves across enclaves and on the fringes of regulatory regimes. In the case of the Forex company, the entrenched localization of racialized economic inequality was crucial to sending profits to the PRC. With the underground bank, Ethnicon Chinese identity is the social glue of trust that coheres underground economies for capital to hop in the ways it does. The profiteering of Chinese migrant entrepreneurs, even if they're relatively small scale and peripheral actors, ultimately deepen global inequality in the aggregate. And I don't mean to single out Chinese traders as bad financial actors or the only ones sending unauthorized remittances or participating in informal economic activities. The South African state and international tax system is designed with secrecy and loopholes to enable profiteering. But individual remittances do add up, and they mirror an older pattern. As Walter Rodney has shown, individual white settlers remitted their profits to their mother countries. In aggregate, Rodney writes, quote, that sum, like all other remittances by colonial banks, represented the exploitation of African land resources and labor, end quote. Of course, I'm not saying Chinese migrant entrepreneurs are the same as European settlers or colonial trading companies. But this logic of entrepreneurial migration, of going somewhere to make money and then getting that money out, holds. So these patterns of accumulation and circulation make uneven geographies. So I want to end with the words of Grant, a longtime Malawian shop worker at China City. He was certain that his boss took a suitcase of cash back to Shanghai in 3-month cycles, taking profits back and importing more goods. Grant said, quote, they just make money and that money is not used in this country, our country. They just take the money and go to their country, end quote. So the conspiracy about what happens to the cash, which there were many, was linked to the criticism that China malls benefited Chinese traders, not African workers and consumers. These were, as Grant distinguished, quote, China malls, not Africa malls. Thanks.